Content warning. This episode contains discussion of sexual crimes against children, as well as the murder of children.
So we are recording this on Thursday, March 30th, 2023. We're actually at the library in Logansport, which is about a 25-minute drive from Peru, Indiana. We just left the Kegan Kline change of plea hearing. Anya, can you give us the high points?
I would say the high points are Kegan Kline pled guilty to all 25 counts remaining that he's charged with, crimes around child sexual abuse materials and identity theft and obstruction of justice. So he pled guilty.
He will not be sentenced until May 18th. Those are the headlines.
And you've probably already seen those, but what we're hoping to do with this episode is sort of take you through what we saw and some of the things that seemed apparent to us just being there, our perceptions. And we'll also be sharing with you a few legal insights if we can provide those, basically about how this all happened, how it went down, what should we expect going forward, what should we be looking out for, what questions should we all be continuing to ask ourselves. My name is Anya Kane. I'm a journalist.
And I'm Kevin Greenlee. I'm an attorney.
We first connected while looking into the Burger Chef murders, an Indiana cold case. Together, we built a spreadsheet documenting hundreds of cases of restaurant-related homicides. That original spreadsheet gave way to our podcast, the Murdersheet.
Now we maintain that same research-centric, investigative approach as we look into all sorts of homicides, including unsolved cases, historical crimes, and, of course, restaurant murders.
We don't just chat about the headlines. Our podcast is a platform for our journalism. The Murdersheet focuses on investigative reporting, thoughtful analysis, thorough research, and in-depth interviews.
We're the Murdersheet.
And this is the Delphi murders, Kegan Kline's change of plea hearing.
We actually arrived at the hearing about an hour and a half early. There's a couple of reasons for this. One, of course, is we want to make sure we get a seat, although that's never been a problem with this court. The other reason is I think we both find it interesting to get an idea of the other sorts of cases that Judge Timothy Spar hears in his court other than Kegan Kline.
Yeah, it's a good way to get a sense of the judge as far as, how he kind of operates day to day, what's he like, and also kind of gives us a greater perception of some of the crimes happening in Indiana's Miami County. So we're sort of legal and crime nerds, so we just are interested in that sort of thing. And we're also I don't want to understate, we are paranoid that if we don't show up super early to one of these things, somehow it'll become a media zoo and we'll get locked out, essentially. So we don't want that to happen. But we woke up very early. If we sound really tired and dead in this episode, that's why. And we drove up here. Peru's beautiful. I just want to say we always kind of do these episodes about these towns and we're focusing on like the worst possible stories, but I really want to underscore how much I love Peru. I love visiting Peru. It's a town that makes me happy. I don't know. I just think everybody's very nice here and I've had a very positive experience. So I just want to give a shout out to Peru because I really think the people here are just like, you hear that a lot about small towns, but like, I feel like that's a small town where that is true. People are very nice.
I want to talk a little bit about the cases that were heard prior to Kegan. There were some drug-related cases. There was a domestic battery case. And then there was the case that was heard, I think, directly before Kegan Kline's case was heard.
That was a rather dramatic case that I hadn't even heard about yet.
This case involved a man named Ronald Carson. He is led into the courtroom in shackles, led by guards. He has a thick beard, many tattoos. One reporter mentioned to us as Carson walked by, I'm getting a definite Charles Manson vibe from this guy.
It was intense.
He was charged with murder. Apparently, he stabbed a man while he was incarcerated at the Miami Correctional Facility.
Yeah, which, of course, is where Kegan has been held.
Yes. And I think it's important to stress that Judge Spar was incredibly patient with all of these defendants, whether they were in there for a drug charge, domestic violence, or in the case of Carson, whether he was there for murder.
Yeah, I feel like he really treats everybody with a lot of courtesy and respect. And I think that shines through in that court.
He doesn't rush through things. He wants each defendant to have a full understanding of all of their rights.
Yeah, and you want that in a judge because, even if it might be tempting to kind of cruise through things, if people are kind of just rubber stamping the process, then, bad things can happen. So taking the time to really engage with each defendant. Do you understand what you're doing? Do you understand what this plea means? Do you understand that you're giving up your right to have a jury of your peers hear the case? I feel like that's a good way of doing things, and that's sort of how we've kind of become accustomed to Judge Spar's mannerisms and his operation in his court. I will say, on the topic of the additional guards and whatnot, when we arrived, interestingly enough, when we were going into the courtroom, we were actually wanded down by some deputies. So the Miami County officials certainly pulled out more security and resources this time around than in previous hearings for Kegan Kline's case. And the reason for that, of course, is because Kegan Kline was here in person today. He was actually in the courtroom as opposed to zooming in from Miami County Jail with his attorney, Andrew Aki. So they were both present today. And as a result, there was a lot of security. They wanted to make sure, we didn't have any weapons. They were, looking at our coats, our bags, everything. And I mean, that's good because it is a high profile case and safety is very important, obviously.
And during the whole time that Kegan was in the courtroom, there were, I believe, 3 sheriff's deputies standing behind him facing the gallery, facing all of the people. So yes, Kegan Kline was there. It was interesting to see him. Kegan Kline is actually younger than Anya, but he looks older than me.
I'm not labeling any judgment about what he's now pled guilty to doing, which is, of course, really horrific stuff. But for any human being, I imagine the stress of being incarcerated can be pretty intense, and we all know stress ages you. So we're not saying this to dunk on him, but it is worth noting that his appearance seems to almost have changed over time, making him look older.
Yeah, he looks much older than his actual age.
He's lost a lot of hair.
He has a very prominent bald spot.
Yeah. And so, I don't know if that would be the case anyway, but I feel like it's worth noting.
He looked at me like he needed to shave.
This guy has been incarcerated for 2.5 years.
He was arrested in
August of 2020. Yeah. So it's been a long time. So again, I'm not putting any judgment on that. I'm just saying that, the stress of being incarcerated, you can kind of see it in his presence, to be honest. He was wearing, of course, the orange jail jumpsuit. It had an 8, the numeral 8 on the back of it. I don't know what that meant. And he seemed to be wearing white sneakers that didn't appear to have any laces.
Right.
So that's sort of his attire, to give you a sense.
His manner, he kept on looking down as if he appeared uncomfortable, perhaps understandably so. He was talking very quietly when he was called upon to speak, almost mumbling. On numerous occasions, either his attorney, Andrew Ackey, or someone else would try to move the microphone closer to Kegan so it would have an easier time picking him up. But I would say during the entire hearing, there were times it was very difficult to hear exactly what Kegan was saying.
And he was also speaking pretty monosyllabic. It was mostly yes, sir, yes, your honor, no, your honor. Although I will note that that is not uncommon. That's pretty much how defendants tend to address the court. You're not supposed to just start going on your soapbox so that's not unusual in and of itself. But he was very quiet, yes. And he didn't seem to be really taking in the audience of the courthouse too much. I wouldn't say he was like looking back a lot or anything like that. He did kind of seem to look around a few times when he was sort of getting up, sitting down, but that wasn't super noticeable. And as for how many people were there were some media there. It wasn't super crowded. I think some members of the community also came in to sort of see what was going on. But it was not a packed house. This was not like some of the Richard Allen hearings that we've been to where, it's standing room only, essentially. Representing the prosecution were Courtney Alwyn. I'm so sorry if we're saying that wrong. We're just winging this. She was representing the Miami County Prosecutor's Office, and she was also accompanied by a Miss Kiefer. Not sure her first name, but those were the two ladies who were sort of representing the prosecution side. And then, of course, Kegan and his attorney, Andrew Ackey, are sitting on the defense side. Ackey is an experienced local defense attorney who's been representing Kegan Kline in this matter.
Before Judge Spar called the hearing to order, he actually reminded the people in the gallery of his earlier decorum orders where things like recordings were not permitted. There was one gentleman there who wanted to sketch the proceedings, and Judge Spar said that was fine.
Yeah, he was sitting next to us, so everybody thought he was our sketch artist, and we were like, no, he's not. We're a podcast.
Yeah, podcasts don't really use sketch
we don't
artists.
But that was fun. We know him. He's a nice guy. And so we basically, I will say I really do appreciate how Judge Spar has handled a lot of this with the press. I mean, there's always media seating, which is helpful. And he also just explains things in a way I think it helps some of the reporters understand, so they're able to factually report the information they're in.
Yeah, not only does he bend over backwards to explain things to defendants, he bends over backwards to explain things to the press.
And God knows we need it. No, I'm just kidding. But I feel like I need it sometimes because some of this legalese, I think you have an easier time with it because you're an attorney, but I think sometimes I've been around it because I've been reporting on this case, and sometimes I have to look at things a few times before I'm like, what does this mean?
So Judge Spar began by making sure Kegan understood his rights. And then there's been some sort of confusion, for lack of a better word, about whether or not there was a plea bargain or a deal between Kegan Kline and Miami County. And that was really cleared up today because Courtney Alwyn of the Miami County Prosecutor's Office, she said she took over this case in January, and literally the day after she got this case, she contacted Andrew Ackey and told him bluntly that there would never be a deal offered to Kegan Kline.
So pretty conclusive, and I will say it's kind of notable that she did that. She seemed very assertive in her presence within court. Even though Ackey and her didn't do a lot of talking, she seemed very assertive. And they seemed congenial. They were kind of talking back and forth a few times, not in a courteous way and in a quiet way, like we couldn't hear what they were saying. But she did seem very keen to immediately state that, because that has been such a point of confusion where people are saying, why is the defense saying there's a deal and the prosecution saying there's no deal? It's still unclear why that happened or where the confusion set in. I think we tend to give people the benefit of the doubt and think that, maybe there was just some sort of strange miscommunication or people were kind of throwing things around. But I mean, according to Miss Alwyn, in this whole situation, there was no deal, and that was the case for many months leading up to where we are now. So it's not like, in her version of events, this was not a situation where they were batting back and forth a few weeks ago and then it all fell apart.
She didn't use any clever lawyer language to obscure the truth or to make the facts harder to understand. She was very clear. I told him there would be no deal, and there was no deal.
And then I guess, Kevin, for people who are a little bit less fond of the legal profession, officers of the court in this setting, you can't lie, right?
If she lies to the court as an officer of the court, yeah, she could face some penalties for that.
Yeah. So, I think I certainly believe her. And certainly that also kind of fits with what we've been hearing, which is for a long time people have been speculating about possible deals that Kegan is making over the Delphi case. And that seemed to have some credibility over the summer when there was this water search and there was all this stuff going on with Kegan. But as fall crept onward, and then certainly as Richard Allen was arrested, it really, we were not hearing about any sort of movement on any sort of deal with Kegan. So that kind of made us think that any rumors of a deal were just that, rumors.
Exactly.
Hey everyone, it's Anya and Kevin.
We're both longtime true crime obsessives. That's why the Murder Sheet emphasizes research, interviews, and digging for the truth. We've led the national media on major crime stories, providing scoops and exclusives to our audience. We've run interviews with some fascinating figures and have more planned ahead. We're proud of the work we do here, and we are so thankful to all of our listeners for making it possible.
If you really enjoy this show and are looking for an opportunity to get even more content, consider joining our Patreon. For $5, you basically get 2 extra episodes a month. What's more, these aren't just any episodes. They're 2 very cool live episodes. You can join in and watch live, weigh in with questions or comments. The works. Those episodes tend to be much looser in terms of our style and format. We'll go behind the scenes on our journalistic process, tell anecdotes about some of the wild things we've seen while reporting, give you our opinions, and try to answer all of the questions you've always wanted to ask us about the cases you care about.
By joining, you'd also be helping directly support us. Podcasting is a tough business for independent voices. The Murder Sheet does not belong to a network, and we're not owned by a mega corporation. So we really appreciate our Patreons for helping to support us.
If you're interested, just go to patreon.com/murdersheet and subscribe at the $5 level. Again, that's patreon.com/murdersheet.
Now, one of the first really interesting things that happened in the hearing, at least from my perspective, was Judge Spar took very seriously his obligation to make sure that Kegan Kline was of sound mind and understood what the consequences of pleading guilty. So he asked Kegan Kline, have you ever been treated for a mental illness? And Kegan Kline said no. But then Kegan Kline says he believes he actually has some mental illnesses. And to be more specific, Kegan Kline told the court that he believes he is bipolar and possibly schizophrenic.
Yes, and to be very clear, what Kegan Kline is claiming here is very much in the vein of self-diagnosis. He's not saying, yes, I spoke with a psychiatrist, during my time in jail or beforehand, and they diagnosed me with these things. He's saying he feels that he has these issues. And so it's interesting. I know that Kegan Kline's father, Tony, also said that he had bipolar disorder. I don't know if there's any sort of family genetic component with that. But as for schizophrenia, yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting that he's bringing this up in court, but it's also clearly very much self-diagnosed. So I think all of that should be taken with a grain of
he made it very clear.
Or a grain of salt. And so
Anya's very
I'm
tired.
so tired, guys.
He made it very clear he's not formally diagnosed with those conditions, but he did tell the judge that he was thinking clearly and rationally when it came to making this decision to change his plea, and he was not under the influence of drugs or alcohol or anything of that nature.
And the reason that Judge Sparr is stressing such things is because you don't want a defendant to turn around and be like, well, yeah, of course I pled guilty. I was really high on meth. Like that kind of calls everything into question. So you want to really, Sparr takes a lot of time to converse with the defendant and really, most of this hearing, there was a huge chunk of it that was just reading out the charges, but a lot of this hearing was basically Sparr and Kline going back and forth. Are you sure you want to do this? Are you sure you want to do this? Are you sure you want to do this? Over and over again in different legal language, essentially, but just, are you sure you don't want a trial? Essentially, again and again.
And as you say, going through the charges, and not only going through the charges, but explaining what the charges meant. Sparr would tell him, you're charged with child solicitation. You're charged with child exploitation. Here is exactly what those charges mean.
Judge Sparr basically is saying things like, do you realize that the burden is on the state to prove that you're guilty? It's not on you to prove that you're innocent. It's on them to prove that you're guilty. So when you're waiving the right to a trial by pleading guilty, that truly means something. And he also is careful to say this, and this is sort of an important thing because it sort of touches upon a wider legal issue. You're not going to be penalized in this court for taking it to trial. There's kind of a perception, and in some cases a reality, I think, in some courthouses, although it should not be this way, that if you fight the charges, they're going to go harder at you, right? If you just cop a plea deal, say what you did, and we'll make a deal and you'll get off. And if you drag it into a trial and it costs this county money and blah, 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 then you're going to get the book thrown at you, essentially. And what Judge Sparr wanted to do, I think, by kind of saying that's not going to be the case here is that, it is your constitutional right to have a trial and to have a jury of your peers, hand down the verdict, essentially. So if you want to do that, that's okay. That's not going to factor into my decision as a judge about what sort of sentence gets handed down at the end of the day. So I think that was very important for him to stress. Because again, unfortunately, that's not always the way it works, but I think he wanted Kegan to know that that is the way it works in Miami County.
And he also wanted Kegan to know there were consequences over and above the sentence itself. Kegan pleading guilty to these charges means he's going to have to be a registered sex offender. He's going to have to be considered an offender against children, which means that he will not have the freedom to live wherever he wants. There's certain areas where offenders against children are not allowed to live. Like
parks and schools, things like that. And he'll have to register as a sex offender. And that will be something that, will follow him around. So he's basically indicating that, even after you get out of, incarceration, whatever that may be, this is going to follow you, essentially. It's kind of like a big, I feel like I saw the change of plea hearing almost as like a big, caution sign flashing over and over again, kind of like, are you sure you want to proceed? Here are all the downsides. Here's everything you need to know about what you're about to do before you do it.
Now, another thing that Judge Sparr needed to be sure of before he allowed Kegan Kline to make the guilty plea is he needed to be comfortable with the idea that Kegan Kline had actually done these offenses. In other words, it wasn't a guilty plea just pulled out of the air. Mm-hmm. And so in order to help him with that, the state had an exhibit. And this exhibit was a disc, a compact disc, which contained on it all of the child sexual abuse material, pictures, videos, and such that were related to counts 1 through 20 of the charges against Kegan.
Which, of course, were all of the counts that involved actual child sexual abuse materials and child sexual exploitation. The remaining charges had to do with online identity theft and obstruction of justice.
Now, usually when the state offers exhibits or when the defense offers exhibits, they are available to the public. But for obvious reasons, the state asked for this exhibit to be under seal. to protect the privacy of the victims.
I forget, Kevin, was this disc, did this contain redacted versions of the child sexual abuse materials?
My understanding was that it did not. It was a little bit confusing because they were, at one point, they were talking about actually having Kegan going up on the witness stand and viewing redacted versions of these images so he could confirm that they were, in fact, the images that he was responsible for either creating or distributing. But Andrew Ackey told the court that Kegan Kline had viewed these redacted images earlier and was able to basically confirm that the images were accurate. So I believe, I'm not 100% sure, but I believe that the versions on the disc were the unredacted images.
Yeah, and basically, I mean, this kind of, your heart goes out to people in law enforcement and people in the judicial system who have to watch this awful, just disgusting stuff in terms of this child sexual abuse materials who, you know, according to what they were reading later, you know, were kids under 18 and then even like kids under 12 at certain points. I mean, the vilest stuff you could imagine.
And so obviously, Judge Spar would have to look at that material on the disc prior to the conclusion of that hearing. But first, it was decided that Kegan Kline would offer direct testimony. And this direct testimony is basically Andrew Ackey going through each element of the charges saying, did you do this part of this offense? Did you do this part? Did you do this part? Kegan Kline would just say yes.
And to be clear, like, this was very specific. It was not, it was like, I mean, I'm making up dates and picture names, but it would be like, did you, when you were in Miami County on May 16th, 2016, you know, possess an image titled, you know, Image A? And you know, it would be like, yes. So basically it's Ackey outlining the basis for each charge and then getting, you know, having Kegan very quietly say yes, basically, to kind of like owning up to those specific incidents that then prompted him to be charged with these crimes.
As Kegan Kline was acknowledging that he was, in fact, guilty of each and every element of every count the state had filed against him, he seemed almost embarrassed or humiliated, which is understandable because these are terrible things to have done.
Yeah, I noticed he kind of seemed to kind of be kind of pumping his foot a bit or kind of jittery a little bit. I mean, it wasn't very noticeable, but I saw that a few times. And I mean, you can imagine people have asked us a lot, why would he plead guilty if he wasn't getting a deal? And I think that's an understandable question because it's hard to wrap your mind around. You've been incarcerated for this long. You're going towards a trial. Why not roll the dice with a jury? Why just kind of quit? But what I saw out there was a lot of anxiety, and this was something that was happening in front of the media and maybe members of the public, but not necessarily people Kegan Kline directly knows. So
and if there was a trial, Kegan Kline's father would be there, a woman he had some sort of romantic relationship with would be there, his friends would be there. In a sense, the whole world would be there. And we got some details today of him acknowledging his guilt of all these charges, but we would have gotten far more details in a trial. So perhaps, and this is speculation, perhaps he was just scared of a trial.
He might have just been scared of a trial, just the emotional side of things. Not, you know, like, I mean, and we're just speculating here. We're not in his mind. Also, you know, he can send us a letter anytime he wants, but, you know, we're not putting money on his books so he can text with us and go sex some other people and just be ridiculous. But I will say, like, I could understand that if you're basically thinking, well, I'm probably going to lose a trial anyway. Sometimes people just give up, right? You know, and it's maybe that's easier, kind of taking the hit. Maybe there's not a lot of innate strategy behind some of this. Maybe it's just somebody giving up. Obviously speculating, but
I'd like to note that, as we said, Aki would be asking Kegan each and every element of these charges, and one would be something to the effect of, did you possess an image of an unclothed young person under the age of 18? Yes. Did this image possess any literary or artistic merit? No.
Why is that element? Because I think that almost sounds like bizarre to people. Like, what literary or artistic merit? Like, what is, can you explain that as far as the law?
I think the easiest way to explain it is over the years, over the centuries, there have been many works of art depicting nudes. You can go to art museums and see nude statues created many thousands of years ago. And I know photographers like Sally Mann have been known for their work depicting, on some occasions, unclothed children. And they're doing this not for sexual purposes, but to try to make some sort of statement about the child and perhaps their innocence or what have you. And so the court does not want to penalize that.
Okay. And so that's why, and I'll tell you, as they were going through, Aki's sort of diligently going through it, but, he would occasionally maybe mess up a number of an image, or...
Once he said, I believe, the letter L instead of the number 1, or
yes.
Forget a dash. Spar was following along.
Oh yeah, he was. Can you redo that? Basically, can you go back and say that? And that's not to jump on Andrew Aki. He was having to read. This went on for a very long time. Because there's 25 charges, and he's having to go in depth on all of them. So it's just more of that. It shows you Spar was very much following along. I'm sure Courtney Alwyn and Miss Kiefer were very much following along. It's just everybody was paying a lot of attention to this part, even though it's sort of like, I think for the people in the audience, the people, in the peanut gallery like us, we might have been kind of, I'll speak for myself. I was kind of like, wow, this is a lot of detail. But I think this was a very important point because it's just, it would be very easy for someone to say, you know what, yeah, I plead guilty, whatever. But having to go through and basically acquiesce on all of these points and all these horrible things and horrible images that Kegan Kline is saying, yes, I did this, I had this. That's another thing. And they want to make sure he's, this is a solid plea.
Certainly in the transcript of the interrogation that we published last year, he was not admitting any guilt whatsoever. It was somebody else. Somebody
hacked his phone and put all these child sexual abuse images on it because that's what people do.
Those defenses were all stripped away today.
Yes.
And he said, no, it was me.
Turns out he was lying about whenever he would pass out due to drugs, his friends would plant child sexual abuse images on his phone. Who could have seen that coming? That was such a good excuse. I'm being sarcastic. I'm sorry. I'm very tired. It's one of those things, it was kind of like chilling to see because when we read those transcripts, it was horrifying. I felt sick for a week having read those. I'm sure a lot of people who read those too can relate to that. And there was so much deflection and not taking responsibility for it and coming up with all sorts of very implausible possibilities about how that happened without Kegan being at fault. And seeing him just kind of quietly, calmly, affirm all of these charges after years. It's like, it's not cathartic, but it's just kind of like, I don't know, makes you feel kind of cold. I don't know.
Basically, Kegan Kline's direct testimony, which was the testimony elicited from his attorney, Andrew Aki, was basically no more than yes, sir, or no, sir, in response to questions about the individual parts of each count. The prosecution did get a chance to do a cross-examination, and their question was basically, Kegan Kline, did you get a chance to review a document that was prepared by the specific doctor who examined all of the child sexual abuse materials and was able to determine beyond a doubt that each of them depicted someone younger than 18, with the exception of count 8. Kegan Kline said, yes, I saw that. And the prosecution, which was Courtney Allwine, said, and of course in count 8, that covers an image or video of someone who you, in a text, at the time laughingly acknowledged was underage, and Kegan Kline agreed to that. So basically, prosecutor Courtney Allwine was able to get Kegan Kline to acknowledge that he knew that all of the people in all of the images were in fact underage.
And the prosecutor even specifically quoted Kegan's message around that count, and it was as follows: "She's only 14, haha." So kind of, while a lot of this was very clinical in its own way of kind of like going through the law, what does law say? Here's the like going through all the charges. Those moments kind of give a glimpse into kind of how horrifying this whole thing was. And, I feel like his devices are like, I imagine for the people who are having to look through that's like entering into hell. Like, not to be over dramatic, but like the amount of like disgusting depravity to be doing that to kids, I don't know. That's just, I don't know. It's horrifying. It's very upsetting.
Yes. As difficult as it was for all of us to read the transcript, imagine how much worse it would be to actually look at those images. Which brings us to the fact that today Judge Spar did look at those images. After the cross-examination, Kegan Kline's defense indicated that they would waive their right to be sentenced within 30 days. And at that point, Judge Spar called a recess so he could go back to his chambers and examine the materials on Exhibit 1 from the state. When he came back about 25 minutes later, he seemed, how would you describe it?
He seems like a very affable guy, like just personality-wise. That's kind of how he comes across in court. He seemed more down, understandably. And
he said in a bit of an emotional voice, he said, yeah, I do definitely want to note that these images do lack serious literary or artistic value.
Yeah. That's an awful thing to have to be viewing, that kind of stuff.
And at that point, he formally found Kegan Kline guilty on all charges.
So it's 25 counts. Remember, he was originally charged with 30. 5 were dropped, but guilty on 25. So is now a good time to talk about what happens next?
Yes. The first step is Judge Spar ordered for there to be a pre-sentence investigation and a pre-sentence report prepared by the probation department. And he scheduled the sentencing of Kegan Kline to occur on Thursday, May 18th at 9 a.m. And I thought it was very significant that Judge Spar made a point of saying he was going to reserve that entire day for the sentencing hearing so he could take as much time as he needed to think about the issues raised and figure out what sort of a sentence he can and will impose on Kegan Kline. There's been a lot of talk about that issue. Basically, it comes down to whether Kegan Kline is charged with 25 things, which he pled guilty to. So that technically that's 25 different sentences. And so what it comes down to is, can he do all of those sentences at one time, or do they have to be done one after each other? In other words, would they be concurrent all at the same time, or would they be consecutive one after each other?
And there's actually a couple of, even Judge Spar indicated that he's going to be thinking about that and that there's room for nuance because there could be certain things that are concurrent and other things that are consecutive. So it's not necessarily all or none. It's basically, my understanding is it's going to come down most likely to some very complicated statutes and sentencing guidelines that are supposed to direct judges in these cases, essentially.
And basically, there's been stuff in the media saying, oh, all of the sentences definitely have to be concurrent, which means Kegan Kline may be a free man as early as the fall. And other people say, no, they can certainly be consecutive and he can be in prison for a long time. And if it was as easy and clear as all of that, I don't imagine that Judge Spar would need an entire day to think about it. And I'll also note that he basically invited Kegan Kline's attorney, Andrew Ackey, to prepare and file a brief with the court explaining his arguments for why he thinks a particular sentence would be appropriate.
And of course, Ackey's already working on this. He noted that he's preparing a brief. He's done a lot of research, he indicated. So he'll be probably advocating for the lighter sentence, for concurrent sentences, for less intense sentence for his client. Obviously, that's his duty as a defense attorney. And he's also probably going to be saying things like, maybe pulling out the fact that Kegan Kline is still relatively young, maybe pulling out the fact that he does not really have a record prior to this from what we know about. At least, so things like that could be something that a judge might consider. And basically, Judge Spar said that he was going to be thinking about as well, aggravating circumstances and mitigating circumstances. And what those mean, tell me if I'm wrong, Mr. Lawyer, but aggravating is stuff that basically makes the crime worse in the eyes of the court. Like if you kill somebody and you do so in a really brutal, heinous fashion, or there's other elements at play, or the victims really suffered before they died, that could be an aggravating factor. Mitigating factor might be that you were severely abused as a child and maybe have some intellectual disabilities, things like that.
Yeah, that covers it.
That covers it. I got it right.
You got it right.
I got it, guys. And so basically he's going to be thinking about that. How does that apply to Kegan? I don't really know about any mitigating factors, although I'm sure, if he wanted to, he made some noises in his interview with Barbara McDonald of HLN that he had a rough childhood, so that could come into play. Aggravating, of course, the fact that these are underage kids. He's behaving like a predator towards them online. I mean, these are not crimes that really sit well with most people, I would say. I don't know. That in and of itself is not an aggravating factor. I don't know, but I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about what could be mitigating or aggravating in his case?
I think you covered the basics. The defense is just going to try to find reasons to argue that it's not as bad as we think, or to make us feel sorry for Kegan.
And I imagine the prosecution is going to be...
We don't need to feel sorry for this guy. Here's reasons to do as much as you can to throw the book at him, if at all possible.
At sentencing, would there be victim impact statements?
There could be potentially victim impact statements. I think that might be complicated by the fact that, if I recall correctly, in the witness list, there was only one victim who was going to participate in the trial. And in a situation like this, where a lot of the victims are underage kids who had their pictures, stolen and were manipulated online, it may be difficult to identify these specific victims.
Or their families and their support systems might not want them to be re-traumatized by doing it. Yeah. Understandable. Do you have any thoughts about concurrent versus consecutive? Because that's what everyone is going to be asking you until this happens.
I think what it boils down to is the issue is not as simple or as clear-cut as anyone would have you believe. Otherwise, Judge Spar would not need an entire day, and he would not need to have Andrew Ackey prepare a written brief on the subject for him.
I don't think it's controversial to say that in Miami County and also in the state of Indiana, there is a bit of... I'm not saying political as in like your traditional politics. I just mean that I don't know if it would be super popular if a high profile online child predator like Kegan Kline, as he confessed to being today, got a very light sentence. But of course, that's not supposed to weigh on the judge. The judge is not there to basically do what's most popular. They're there to interpret the law and follow the law and ensure that that is what is carrying the day. So even though if he ends up getting a lighter sentence, I don't think that's necessarily a statement about how serious the crimes are. I think it's probably more of a statement on how sentencing mandates and guidelines work.
So after the hearing, Prosecutor Courtney Allwine had a few words to offer to the media about what had happened and what was to come.
We were in a bit of a press gaggle, so there were a couple of folks there kind of gathered to hear her words. And
5 counts that are coming against them this morning. The sentencing hearing is set for May 18th at 9 a.m. A pre-sentence investigation has been reported. Other than that, we will come back for that sentencing hearing and finish this out.
Can you tell us what's going on with it? What is a pre-sentence investigation? What all happens with that?
A pre-sentence investigation is a report completed by the probation department in which it's a complete report about an individual's life, their family history, educational history, mental health history, criminal history. It's really a report about a person. The probation department will then complete a recommendation of what the sentence should ultimately be. Thank you all.
Sorry, the audio sounds like how it does. We weren't fighting with anybody or pushing anyone around. I don't know what all that scratching sound is. And then we basically left. I mean, that's kind of... Kevin did almost fall down 2 sets of stairs on the way out, though, I will note.
Anya's not the only one that was tired. So the mitigating factor in my clumsiness was I did not get much sleep last night.
Neither of us did. So, we're kind of processing all of this along with the rest of you. It's kind of an interesting point, I guess, to be following this case because on the one hand, it's like, I'm sure a relief for some of the Miami County officials. They're not going to have a real big, expensive trial. They're not going to have to possibly re-traumatize witnesses or victims in this case. But on the other hand, in our view, a trial is a great opportunity for a lot of information about a high-profile case to become public. That's where the prosecution has to say, here's all the evidence against this person. And that's where the defense has to say, here's exculpatory evidence that maybe goes against their guilt. And both sides have to duke it out in our adversarial system, and that can be a really great opportunity for the public to learn something and learn more about key details. And we know from the prosecution list that a lot of the people who were in that list worked in some capacity on the Delphi investigation as well. I'm speaking specifically about Indiana State Police's David Vito, the FBI's Nicole Robertson. There's names that come up. And all of that is interesting. And of course, I mean, at this point, Kegan's connection to Delphi remains salient. This is a person who police say was communicating with Libby before the murders. But at the same time, it remains very vague because I think if they had evidence against him that warranted a case that he would be charged with, I think a lot of people want to think that police are doing some grand strategic test game, and I kind of tend to feel like things are probably a little bit simpler than that in some ways. If there's no evidence, you don't charge someone, or if there's not enough evidence, you don't charge someone. And right now, another man has been charged, Rick Allen, of course, and we're all waiting to see what happens with that in June. But
before then, there's a lot to talk about in terms of the case as a whole, in terms of what's going to happen with Kegan Kline, and also in terms of his sentencing, which again will be on May 18th. And we will be back in Peru to cover it and let you all know exactly what happens.
Thanks so much for listening. And thanks to the Logansport Library.
Thanks so much for listening to the Murder Sheet. If you have a tip concerning one of the cases we cover, please email us at murdersheet murdersheet@gmail.com. If you have actionable information about an unsolved crime, please report it to the appropriate authorities.
If you're interested in joining our Patreon, that's available at www.patreon.com/murdersheet. If you want to tip us a bit of money for records requests, you can do so at www.buymeacoffee.com/murdersheet. We very much appreciate any support.
Special thanks to Kevin Tyler Greenlee, who composed the music for the Murder Sheet, and who you can find on the web at kevintg.com.
If you're looking to talk with other listeners about a case we've covered, you can join the Murder Sheet discussion group on Facebook. We mostly focus our time on research and reporting, so we're not on social media much. We do try to check our email account, but we ask for patience as we often receive a lot of messages. Thanks again for listening.